This week's podcast is a muscle masterclass with Dr. Mac. We're talking muscle hypertrophy 101, the concept of keeping the main thing main, training for your muscle type, muscle fiber types, energy system training, what's important in bodybuilding, what's important in other sports. Let's rip in.
Welcome to the Body Science Podcast, bringing you everything you need, want, and should know about health, fitness, nutrition, and training. As always, the information contained in this podcast is for the information purposes only and is not designed to diagnose or be prescriptive to treat, prevent, or manage any injury, disease, or other health-related condition. All information provided in the podcast is the opinion of the individual and other contributors and does not represent the policy, procedure, or opinion of any other corporate entity or third party. Warning, this Body Science Podcast occasionally contains strong language, which may be unsuitable for children, unusual humour, which may be unsuitable for some adults, and advanced science, which may be unsuitable for bro science majors. Stay tuned. The Body Science Podcast is about to start.
Burn the fat and feed the muscles with this high-protein, low-carb, low-fat, best-tasting daily protein powder. Hydroxyburn-lean 5 proteins are released in a sustained chronological order, therefore maintaining their different absorption rates, fast and slow, ensuring constant muscle fuel so you stay fit, happy and healthy. This synergistic blend also includes 17 vitamins and minerals, added carnitine, and a proprietary blend of digestive enzymes, Digizyme, and Orafti prebiotic to aid digestive health.
Welcome to Body Science Headquarters. We're here at the home of Fit, Happy, Healthy. I've got my guru in the corner. You hate that word, that's why I said it. Dr. Chris McLellan. Today he's talking about training for your muscle type. It's a good one. And I'm going to start this off like in the previous podcast, you've gone on about keeping the main thing the main thing. What are we doing here?
Greg. So that's my...
Finish that protein bar, you're right? Just want to swallow that?
High protein bar, low carb, cookies and cookie dough. One of the best you'll buy.
Yeah, nice.
Actually, not one, the best.
Yeah.
Anyone who's on their time-restricted diurnal, intermittent modified keto with target fasting, I highly recommend it. So, it's not a very exciting story, but it's all about keeping the main thing the main thing. And so I was often asked what my philosophy was around training when I was coming through the ranks as a young strength conditioning coach. And my philosophy was always pretty simple. Turn up on time every time, train hard, go home, eat, go to sleep, come back and do it again the next day. That didn't seem to appease the people who are asking me the question. So I guess maybe a decade ago, with the evolution of social media and the amount of things that you see on social media, and more so with my little segue in recent years into more the bodybuilding physique industry, I see a whole lot of people, mainly girls, who are just training in what I consider to be a pretty random fashion to bring about the goals that they want. Yep. So if you're in physique, if you're in bodybuilding, and by bodybuilding, we say this all the time, I mean bikini, figure, fitness, all of those, all encompassed into physique competition or bodybuilding. It doesn't matter what your 1RM squat is. It doesn't matter what you can deadlift. It's about your ability to develop muscle mass in the right proportions. And hence, my philosophy is very much about keep the main thing the main thing. If you want to be strong, then absolutely you have to recruit high order motor units and you need to lift heavy weights above 85% of your 1RM, and we've known that for decades. If you want to be an endurance athlete, you need to train accordingly in an endurance manner. If you want to develop muscle mass for hypertrophy, then it doesn't matter how strong you are. Right, and there's a justification for lifting heavy, certainly to recruit what we're going to talk about in a minute, a little bit about type 1, type 2 fibres and that sort of thing. Yep. But we know we have the information around fibre type distribution, and that's the other thing we'll get to this in this podcast is around training specificity around fibre type distribution. So based on the research, it's actually pretty old, it's from the 70s around, for example, in a gluteus maximus, in the gluteals, and everyone listening to this will know what that muscle is. What's the fibre type distribution? Is it predominantly type 1, type 2? What are we working with? Well, the answer is it's about 50-50. It's probably 55-45 slow twitch to fast twitch. So how you train your glutes, the glutes are the easiest muscle in the body to develop. Absolutely. No question. And I think, so how you train them is specific to that. If you want to recruit lower order motor units, type 1 fibres, You got high volume. That's how you train them.
Yep.
If you want to recruit higher order motor units, type 2 fibres, fast twitch fibres, you've got to train them heavy. So you've got to mix it up. But even then, 1 RMs and 2 RMs, you don't need them in your kit bag. You really don't. It doesn't make any difference. So that's the evolution of the, keep the main thing the main thing.
Yep.
I'm looking at you through this little thing here. And it's the same with CrossFitters, and there's definitely a rationale for implementing variation in your training. No question, right? We've talked about this, that we want some variation, but we also need specificity, and we need that specificity around our outcome. Otherwise, you're going to diminish your outcomes. Your results won't reflect that. So that's something of a rationale for our chat today. Let's just keep it pretty simple. If you want to be a CrossFitter, go and do CrossFit. But if you want to play in the NFL or the NHL or the NRL or any of those football codes, that's not CrossFit.
Yep.
You might do an odd CrossFit session for variation. Sounds like a great idea. Why not? But if that's all you do day in, day out, then you're going to be underprepared.
Okay.
So that's the philosophy of keeping the main thing the main thing.
Well, do you want to touch more on what are the muscle fibre types?
Sure. Yeah. So the very early work around muscle fibre types, and people listening to this will be educated, and they will have heard of fast twitch and slow twitch.
Yep.
And red and white and this sort of thing. And we've known that I think it's maybe the 1600s. It's been around forever. The evolution of that has evolved to how we determine it, and there's now some very good technology. For decades, we've used biopsy, which is
nasty.
Yeah, well, literally taking a small piece of muscle and analysing it under a microscope and determining what the fibre type distribution is.
Yep.
There's some evolution of measurement techniques has gone into more non-invasive techniques using MRI and modified versions of that. So that's not available to the average person going to the gym. It's cost prohibitive, and even access would be limited. And same with biopsies. Biopsies outside of the university sector or outside of elite sport, I mean, you can't just go down to your local QML and say, I want to get a biopsy done. It's not going to happen. So we have to refer to the research and the cadaver-based studies from the 70s that have given us some information around population norms, the distribution of different fibre types. And they're going to vary considerably with individuals. However, that's a starting point for us. And in terms of literally with fibre types, we have, within muscle, we have small elements of those called myofilaments or fibrils, and we have myofilaments. Myo meaning muscle, filament meaning the small, call it the contractile part of a muscle. And so we have contractile proteins, we have regulatory proteins, and we have what are called structural proteins. The contractile proteins most people will have heard of. That's actin and myosin, and they're what are called the thick and thin filaments of a muscle. And they play a role in the sliding filament theory and excitation, contraction, coupling. All that means is that they're the little parts of the muscle that are pulled together and cross over one another to cause a contraction. So there's a stimulus comes through, causes a whole range of changes within the muscle, comes down through a T-tubule into what's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. There's a release of calcium. Calcium changes the orientation of some regulatory proteins that sit on the contractile proteins. One's called troponin, tropomyosin. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds with it, but what that does is makes the little pieces that contract with one another available, and then literally they pull each other across one another, and the muscle shortens. And that's the contractor. That's the concentric component of a muscle, and then the reversal of that is the eccentric component. So that's nothing new to our audience, and I'm sure they're familiar with that. Whether or not it's a fast twitch or a slow twitch refers to, well, the word twitch refers to the rate at which the contraction occurs. Yep. And that speed of contraction is regulated by an enzyme that's called ATPase, which sits on the head of the myosin contractile element of the muscle itself. So within that, we've got at another level, just for those that are interested in this level of understanding of the muscle, in about 1988, there was some new. So when I went to uni, I was always taught it was pretty much just fast and slow. and you couldn't change that. So
can we change now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. And as actually the more recent research tells us that there's a huge amount of variation that exists with exposure. And there's been studies done on twins where one twin has become an athlete, the other twin has become a non-athlete, and their fibre type distribution later in life is completely different.
Okay, that's interesting.
So it's very much exercise and environment dependent. But
can we put that reference?
I'll find it somewhere for sure. But so with respect to, we have some what we call pure fibre types is probably an easy way to put it, from slow to fast. It has to do with the myosin heavy chain. So type 1, 2A and 2X are the three pure types from slow to fast. And then we have hybrids. So we can have a hybrid of a type, say a 1 and a 2A. We can have a 2 and a 2X. So the take-home message is that it's not an all or nothing or a black and white type of scenario. We can have blends of these muscle fibre types within the body. And in fact, what a lot of the more recent research is telling us that people who are sedentary, who don't do any exercise pretty much, tend to have a higher distribution of these hybrids. They're more generalist muscle fibres. Okay. They're not specific for anything. And it could be up to 40% of their fibres are hybrid, a little bit of both. The more highly trained you are, the more specificity you'll have. So very highly trained athletes may have no hybrids. They might have a large distribution of either type 1 if they're endurance-based, or they may have a substantial amount of type 2 if they're an explosive athlete, 100-metre sprinter, whatever. So conversion does happen. I remember when I went to uni, we were taught that conversion didn't really happen, but it absolutely does. We can see 2A, 2Xs convert to 2As, and it absolutely will. And that'll depend on the type of training. But there's also a reversibility effect that happens. So there's a use it or lose it situation occurring with muscle as well. So if you don't train, you will perhaps take on more of those hybrid type characteristics, and you'll lose the fast twitch component, the pure fast twitch or the pure slow twitch components of it. So you think about it, exposure time and intensity as our two key variables with that approach.
Okay.
You're going to ask me if you can, how do you grow them? How do you make them develop?
I was going to ask, how does an athlete actually tell, and why would they give a shit? But that's probably not relevant.
Oh, how can they tell? Well, they can't tell. They can't tell without either a biopsy or a MRI.
So when you're writing a training program,
yeah. So I will base the way I do it anyway, which is probably not like how most people do it, but I know what the fibre type distribution is.
Some little secrets coming out here?
I don't know. It's not rocket science. It's just that I've gone out of my way to find out what it is.
Yep.
And it's not something that you will pick up on in your university degree, or you won't get it in your
Cert 4
training. You definitely won't get it in your Cert 4. But the research exists, but you've got to dig fairly deeply to determine what these fibre types are. It depends a lot on what you're trying to achieve. So if you're looking for hypertrophy, so if we're talking more around muscle fibre type development here than we're talking about endurance training.
Yep.
For this approach for muscle fibre type specific training. So if you think about the variables that go into hypertrophy, so hypertrophy is the development of muscle mass. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the traditional way that we do that is we manipulate the variables of training, so resistance training variables, things like the muscle action, so concentric or eccentric. We talk about the volume or the total workload of a training session. We talk about the intensity. So the intensity in resistance training refers to the amount of load on the bar, or a percentage of your maximum capabilities. We talk about 1 RM, our 1 rep max. You'd be familiar with that term. And then we talk about the selection of exercises, and that's a bit of a bugbear of mine as well. We'll get to it. And the order we do them. Then we play around with the inter-set rest periods, because we can have a large amount of impact on the outcomes of a session based on things like metabolic byproducts. So we know that growth hormone adaptations released from the pituitary are stimulated by hydrogen ions, fundamentally. Hydrogen ions coming from metabolic byproduct of muscle contraction. So circuits, really, really fundamentally. So we talk about rep velocity, tempo. So all of it comes down to a specificity around what am I trying to get here. So muscle hypertrophy's as a general comment, less dependent on the strain or the resistance and more dependent on the total volume or the training workload overall. And that we play around with that with the number of reps we do. So the total volume load, sets times reps times load is one way of doing that. And all of that is geared towards increasing our cross-sectional area. Because, like we've said in lots of previous podcasts, the body needs to be encouraged to adapt. So
can I ask a dumb question here?
You always throw me off track, but yeah, go for it.
So the body's about adapting. The training's about getting the body to adapt.
Yeah.
Do I just wake up tomorrow and my muscle type's changed?
No.
No. So what are we talking here?
Do you mean duration?
Yeah, like...
it happens quickly.
It does?
Yeah, within weeks.
Is that right?
Yeah,
within
the adaptation occurs very, very quickly.
Okay.
So, again, that's going to depend on whether you train once a week or four times a week.
On that.
And I can't give you the exact diagnosis there, but the answer is it happens and it happens quickly. It doesn't happen overnight, but it will happen quickly. So...
Could be a hair commercial.
It could be, and I'm not surprised that you took it there, but that's okay. So... that's all about, so you've got to remember, muscle is what's called a post-mitotic tissue, and that means it doesn't undergo a large amount of cell replacement during life. We've got to, it's a really dynamic balance between protein synthesis and protein degradation. And hypertrophy is mediated by, we've talked about these before as well, they're called satellite cells, and they reside within what's called the basal lamina and the sarcolemma, which within the tissue. And so these, what they call myogenic stem cells, they're normally quiescent, so they're normally asleep, let's just say. They're normally non-active, and they become active when they've got sufficient stimuli to become active. And that comes into a conversation around the vast majority of research now tells us, and there's some good work. There's a guy, Brad Schoenfeld, who did a really big meta-analysis a few years ago talking about hypertrophy, and we'll attach it to this. And I'm all about recognising the research and work done by these guys. And Brad's done a great job. One of the things we need metabolic demand, and we need what's called mechanotransduction. You need load. We also need a little bit of microtrauma, a little bit of muscle damage as part of it. And that's part of that normal. Remember I talked about the two little contractile components of the muscle crossing over?
Yep.
Okay, so as they cross and as they revert back, they have to delatch. So with eccentric exercise, right? We often are sore from a lot of eccentric exercise.
Okay.
Well, the other question is, but a lot of people say, why am I stronger eccentrically than I am concentrically? So it's a question I get all the time. So just to be really clear on what I mean by that, if you're doing a bench press, for example, people will often be able to lower a bar under control that weighs, let's say, 80 kilos.
Yep.
But they don't have the ability to concentrically push it back up. So they're stronger. I can control that on the way down eccentrically, but I can't push it back up. That means I'm stronger effectively. Really, I'm breaking it down here, but really I'm stronger eccentrically than concentrically. And it comes down to when those little contractile elements cross over one another, they have to be undone. And the delatching process is like they connect on, then there's a larger amount of energy required to delatch them. And that delatching causes some of the microtrauma that causes post-exercise muscle soreness.
Okay.
And so you're sore after a workout because of microtrauma. It's got nothing to do with lactate or lactic acid. And if anyone's ever still teaching that, please get up and walk out of the room. Anyway, we have these things called myogenic stem cells. And like I said, they're normally quiescent. But when they're stimulated, they become active and they proliferate, and then they go and fuse with the existing muscle cells and they donate nuclei effectively. Now, that is part of the repair process that occurs post-workout. And it's that exercise-induced muscle damage that stimulates some of that satellite cell proliferation that occurs post-exercise. And so it's a pretty dynamic scenario in terms of what causes that muscle adaptation. And there's two, talk about autocrine and paracrine adaptations. And that we're getting really deep in the reeds with that, but autocrine adaptation refers to stimulation of protein synthesis, which is the anabolic adaptation, so repair,
Yep.
through an increase in anabolic signaling pathways. And a lot of people talk about a thing called mammalian target of rapamycin, mTOR pathway. And for the listeners that are, like their muscle physiology, they will have heard of the mTOR pathway as the primary anabolic pathway associated with muscle mass development. The other one is paracrine adaptation. Paracrine adaptation is an increase in satellite cell activation or the proliferation of those myogenic stem cells, and they fuse onto the cells. So, you with me?
Yeah, I'm all the way.
So there's a bit going on there, and not to lose anybody, but there's a process that occurs there. We need stimuli to bring about muscle adaptation. So mechanical stress is a big one. You've got to train, right?
Yep.
It's not going to matter what your diet's like or, what you put in your system. You've got to bring about some sort of stimuli to induce adaptation. The other one's metabolic stress, as I mentioned, and the other one's muscle damage. There's a few others in there as well with some reactive oxygen species and things like cellular swelling, but we don't really need to go there for this. So the metabolic side of it is about things like lactate. It's about hydrogen ions. The whole process of hypoxia is something I'm really interested in.
Okay.
We probably do a podcast just on that because there's some really cool research coming out about normobaric hypoxia. Think of, I don't know if you've ever done any blood flow restriction training, BFR?
Not really.
No. So it's called the KATSU method. It's been around for quite some time, but it's basically not completely occluding, limiting the blood flow to a limb. And in that state of hypoxia, so low oxygen, we get a proliferation of adaptation within the muscle around all those things I mentioned, hydrogen ions, nitric oxide synthase, all these metabolic byproducts that stimulate satellite cell proliferation. And the hydrogen ions also will stimulate the pituitary gland to release growth hormone. Okay. We talked about growth hormone before as well. So there's a whole lot of mechanisms there associated with adaptation post-exercise, which is, I think,
and what type of athletes are you playing in that area with?
Everybody.
Yeah?
Yeah, everybody. So anyone who wants muscle mass adaptation. And the beauty of some of the more mainstream normobaric hypoxia training now has great implications into older pops because there's a decreased amount of overall load on wear and tear on the joints. But we'll do another podcast on that another time, and we'll probably stick with what we're talking about here. The mechanotransduction side of it is literally mechanical tension, which is another key element. So there's a metabolic component and then there's a mechanotransduction component. So the mechanotransduction is within the sarcolemma around the muscle. We have these, call them mechanosensors, and they convert, I'm overviewing a lot of pretty intense physiology here, but they convert mechanical energy into chemical signals that then mediate intracellular anabolic and catabolic pathways. So then mTOR is the big one. And the other one's this mitogen activated protein kinase, which is the MAPK pathway. When you get a lot of resistance, right, high resistance lengthening contractions, so strength training, we get an increase in phosphorylation of a what's called a P70SK kinase. Anyway, it doesn't matter too much, but large amounts of muscle mass, we have a larger amount of this phosphorylation of this enzyme that ultimately has a shift in muscle balance, and that's an autocrine pathway. It stimulates those the fusion of those myogenic stem cells, which is pretty cool physiology in terms of muscle mass development and adaptation. But it's also around not just getting large amounts of muscle, but it's also about maintaining muscle. So when people go into are trying to lose fat, and we've talked about that in our podcasts all the time, you don't want to sacrifice a lot of muscle. Yeah. So you still need to have that resistance training component to preserve the muscle mass you've got. That's the perfect scenario. And the older you get, the more important that probably is for maintaining activities of daily living and independence and all the good stuff, reduce risk of falls, recovery from disease, the list of things that are health-related benefits to maintaining lean muscle mass, it's a long list. It's enormous.
Okay.
Surviving cancer and all sorts of things. So I know I'm on a rant. People don't like when I get on a rant all the time.
I can't tell the difference between rant and science.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a bit of both. But anyway, so when we do high intensity resistance training, we get a lot of that high mechanical tension, that mechanotransduction. When we do more low intensity circuits, it's more of the metabolic adaptation. And either way, they both lead to fibre recruitment, a little bit of muscle damage, maybe with the higher intensity work. We get all of those stem cell adaptations. We get some the byproducts, metabolic byproducts like nitric oxide and so forth will adapt. We get autocrine and paracrine adaptations, and ultimately, if we get it all right, we lead to hypertrophy.
Nice.
And adaptation, yeah. So that's the, 10-minute overview of what we're talking about. But it all comes down to your key training variables, right? You've got progressive overload, you've got specificity, you've got variation, individualization is huge. That's the one I see a lot on social media, and we've got a forum for people to post what they do in the gym, and we've got a lot of monkey see, monkey do going on in our world, whereby someone sees a very elite, very experienced athlete doing an exercise that is far beyond the capabilities of the average gym goer. Nordic hamstring is where you are kneeling down, basically. You keep your torso upright.
There's your first problem. I'm on my knees.
Right. Well, you can be on a padded thing, and you need your feet secured or anchored so that you don't tip forward, and then you keep
I'm seeing that everywhere on Instagram at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So you've got people who are then, they're tilting forward.
Yeah.
Right, okay. So if I wanted to tear your hamstring, I'd get you to go and do that now, right? And you see some people doing it, they'll go all the way down and then they'll come all the way back up. Let me tell you, if you can't do a laying leg curl with about double your body weight, you've got no business trying to do that. It looks cool, and I'm seeing some people on Instagram and some good friends of mine are posting things with them doing that, and I love them because they're good friends of mine, but I shake my head because I just say there's no way in the world that 95% of the population, even athletic population, even guys I work with at an elite level in AFL, NRL, they can't do that. But if you're a 45 kilo whippet with a huge amount of muscle mass and a background in gymnastics and you've been training your whole life, then maybe, it's not one of those exercises. It looks great and it rips into your hamstrings, but there's probably other exercises. Well, not probably. There are other exercises that we can implement that are equally as beneficial for developing hamstrings. Mm-hmm. And my other little rant in the world of, I guess, that market around females who are competing in physique contests, it's normally about glutes and delts. That's what you need.
Yep.
Well, because that's been the case for about a decade, everyone's now got glutes and delts. So, ladies, hamstrings are the new glutes, let me tell you, because the girls that are winning at an elite level now have got exceptional glute, we call it glute hamstring tie-in.
Yep.
They've got separation in their glutes from a posterior perspective, and they've got separation from a quad hamstring tie-in when they turn on their side. And they're the new glutes. They're the girls that are going to win. So we're going to talk about that, because developing hamstrings and developing glutes are two very, very different challenges. And there's some biomechanical reasons why that is, and some morphological reasons. So morphological with respect to the actual makeup of the muscle and the distribution of the fibre types. Lost you, or are you with me?
No, I'm with you on that one.
Yeah. So
I'm just letting you rant.
Yeah. Well, glute training, because again, I see a lot of girls deadlift, and there's some interesting variations we see on deadlift technique, depending on where you've been taught and how you've been taught how to do it. And because you've got to remember, okay, I'll just carry on. So you've got to remember, if you're going to train glutes and you want to train hamstrings, you've got to think from a biomechanics perspective. You've got the pelvis and you've got the femur.
Yep.
Right. So you have two different types of mechanisms here. You have pelvis on femur movement, right? So the femur stays fixed and the pelvis moves, right? And then you've got, so think deadlift, right? Then you've got femur movement on the pelvis. So the femur moves and the pelvis stays fixed. And that's things like reverse hypers and things like that. So And then you've got an exercise like the Nordic hamstring, which is effectively femur on tibia. Right? So we're talking distal hamstring now. So we've got proximal hamstring with pelvis on femur, and then we've got distal hamstring. So they're very different, exercises from a mechanics perspective. And what I'm seeing is lots of people trying to implement really advanced exercises. Actually, what I'm seeing right now is the opposite of that. You know, the bands, everyone's using the bands and everything. I can tell you how many girls develop world-class physiques with bands. None, right? How do girls, if you look at the girls, they might be selling them, but if you want to develop world-class physique, you can't get away from the basics. You got to deadlift, you got to squat. That's just tough.
Yep.
That's how you do it. So if you're thinking pelvis on femur, you're thinking things like Romanian deadlifts, stiff leg deadlifts, good mornings, glute hamstring raises, things like that. If you're thinking pelvis on femur, you're thinking things like reverse hypers, sprinter lunge, things like that. Femur on tibias, your Nordics, glute hams raises, hip thrusts, things like that as well. You get an element of pelvis on femur with your thrust. Thrusts become hugely popular, of course. Everyone's doing glute thrusts. You doing them?
They look good.
Are you doing them?
They look good.
Please
on Instagram.
Tell me you're not doing them.
I'm not doing them.
No, good.
I've had back surgery, mate. It's the last thing I'm doing.
Whoa, yeah. Anyway, so probably leads into
I don't think any bald 50-year-old man should be seen doing those
either.
either.
You've got no business doing them, so I'm pleased to hear that you're not.
Yep.
So it leads into that conversation around fibre types. So we know some stuff, and this is down to keeping the main thing. If you want to hit glutes are roughly 50-50 fast twitch, slow twitch, right? We've already mentioned.
Yeah, 50-50.
50-50. But your bicep femoris, which is the big biarticular muscle, means that it crosses two joints, right? So if you think about your hamstring, bicep femoris being the main one is about 65 to 70% slow twitch and only about 30 to 35% fast twitch, right? Whereas your quad, your rectus femoris, is going to be the opposite of that.
Okay. So
your quads, so rectus femoris, vastus lateralis, and even vastus medialis, which are your quadricep muscles, are going to be 30, maybe 35, 40% slow and maybe 65, 70% fast twitch.
Okay.
So how you hit glutes versus how you hit hammies versus how you hit quads are very different in terms of your prioritisation of exercises. And, well, not just exercises, but reps and sets. So literally, if you want to work glutes, you've got to mix it up. Heavy stuff and higher volume work. If you want to work hamstrings, you got to hit them pretty heavy.
Okay.
Yeah. If you want to hit rec fem, you pretty much got to go, the other way around, Hamstrings, you need to go higher volume. They're 60% slow twitch. So you need to go higher volume. Higher volume, I mean 12s, 15s, 18 reps. Yeah. And it might only be 65, 70% of your 1 RM.
Okay.
Yeah. Whereas if you want to hit quads, you're talking, okay, well, I've only got about 30 or 40% low twitch. I'm still going to have to squat heavy. And unfortunately, the best exercise for hitting quads is probably still squats. But I don't have to, I've got to go heavy. I don't need to do a ton of volume. And then it'll vary. The adductors, so adductor magnus, longus brevis, and those type of muscles, roughly 50-50, maybe a little bit more, sort of 60% slow twitch. Your gastroc, so your calf, your big calf, the big lateral gastroc is about 50-50. But interestingly, soleus or soleus, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is about 85% slow. So high volume for soleus. How do you hit soleus versus gastroc?
That's a good question.
Know. Easy. So because gastroc is biarticular, if you want to take gastrocnemius out of the exercise and work your soleus, which sits underneath the gastroc, bend your knee.
Okay.
So seated calf raises aren't for your gastroc, they're for soleus, and they're high rep. So you don't need to put 18 plates on a seated calf raise. You need to do 20 reps. And that's pretty much how you do it. So, you can mix it up pretty considerably around that. So you think there's a whole different range to that. So there's a guy, and again, we'll recognise the work that, Brett Contreras, the glute guy, has been, done a PhD on it, I think. Made an industry out of training glutes. I don't think he claims that he invented the thrust. I hope not. I think he claims to have brought it to the fitness industry, and that's cool. So he's there's a couple of different types of thrusts you can do. There's thrusts off a bench. There's thrusts on the floor. Yeah, you can modify that pretty significantly how you want to do it. Hip thrusting absolutely recruits your glute max, no question, right? And every mainly girl who's done that will agree to it, and that's probably most people's go-to. And certainly you will have a larger amount of you got about a 300% increase in glute max recruitment from a thrust off a bench than a squat.
300%.
Yeah, it's pretty big, and that's based on Contreras' research.
Okay.
Quad-wise, it's probably comparable, but for glutes, you'll get a much larger recruitment. So if you do a hip thrust off the floor, though, you'll get a larger amount of hamstring versus glute for that type of movement. So even there's an example of just manipulating, shift up your thrust, and you can hit more glute or more hamstring.
Yep.
And then there you can put your feet close together or put them a little bit wider apart. You can recruit a little bit more adductor, things like that. And then what else? Reverse hypers are a really good exercise for developing glutes. So reverse hyper is where you would lie. There are machines, but it's effectively where you would put your torso on a bench, keep your legs straight, and bring the leg up to do like a back extension. Only your back doesn't move, your legs move. Mm-hmm. People can Google what a reverse hyper is. Reverse hyper will give you comparable glute max, glute activation, and hamstrings to a thrust.
Okay.
So there's a few different things you can do there. Deadlift-wise, much larger amount of hamstrings versus all the other lifts. So if you want to hit your hammies, you still got a deadlift. That's the inconvenient truth of life. And then even within deadlifting, variations with Romanian deadlifts, Romanians will give you about 300 or 400% more adductor than they will a thrust. So if you want to bring your adductors in, and for total leg development, you need to develop your adductors. They're the inside of your leg muscles. Yeah, okay. So there's a few different things you can do to manipulate that. Same with back extensions. They're comparable with things like deadlifts and thrusts for hamstrings, much more so than glutes. And what's interesting, because a lot of people ask me about specificity, do I need to squat all the way to the floor, or can I just do half squats? So if you look at the research in terms of recruitment profiles based on EMG, electromyography, so we can measure the electrical activity in the muscles, and that's how we do these. There's not a lot of difference, right? So
is that right?
Yeah, you can pretty much do a half squat and get. But the problem is that most people say they're doing a half squat, but they're only doing like a quarter squat. You've still got to go to about 90 degrees of knee flexion, and you'll recruit roughly. It's a little bit different, but roughly the same amount of a quadricep versus going all the way to the bottom of the floor.
Okay.
So you don't really need to do it. The other one that's really good exercise for your glutes is a high bench step. So, but it's got to be high, almost so high that you need someone to help you get up there, because it puts you into a hip flexion position. So you've got a large amount of gluteal extension, stretch effectively happening, and then you step through onto the bench and you recruit your glutes. A fair amount of that. So if you want to, if your priority is glutes, then you need to really work you need a bit of everything is probably the take-home message. And a lot of people are doing that in terms of the exercise selection to isolate those. If you just want to concentrate on quads, then you still have to stay with the squats.
Okay.
You can't get away with it. You don't need to do a hell of a lot of deadlifting if you just want to develop your squats, your quads, and less so on the thrusts as well. And hammies, if your priority is hamstrings, and that's I just started this chat off by saying that it is for a lot of competitors now, then you got to deadlift and mix them in with your Romanians, and you should get good adaptation off the back of it.
Sweet. Okay, Dr. Max. So I see people doing these Nordics on the floor versus using the pull-down seat. What's the best way?
So either can be effective, though, like I said before, there's a fair risk of injury with it. And if you're doing them on the floor and you're kneeling on the floor and someone's holding your feet, then what's the worst case scenario? Well, the idea is that you're able to literally relax and fall forward and you can catch yourself with your hands.
Yep.
So safety factor high. If you're doing it turned around and for the listeners who haven't tried this, and I'm not recommending you do, so you take a pull-down machine that has a seat and a pad for supposed to be for your thighs, turn around on it, kneel on it, and tuck your heels underneath the pad. That's what you're talking about, yeah? And then you let your torso go forward. Well, what's the default is that when you have to release, you've got to fall all the way to the floor. So nowhere near as safe would be the comment I would make to you. And I see a lot of people doing these and they're only moving maybe 10, 15 degrees. They're sort of just swaying. You're wasting your time. Just in terms of bang for your buck, in terms of being able to recruit hamstrings, one of the keys is having a full range of movement, right? And so little partial, active contraction and relax is not really achieving much at all in terms of muscle adaptation. And the hammies are really, anatomically, if you think about the hamstrings, they're predisposed to injury, perhaps more so than any other muscle in the body. They are biarticular in nature, so when you run or when you are doing any sort of activity, they're involved with hip flexion and during knee extension, you get this concentric contraction with a large amount of lengthening. So you get concurrent hip flexion and knee extension. The most common time people tear their hamstrings when they're running, it's during terminal swing phase. It's as your foot comes down to the ground and you're extending at the knee and you are flexing at the hip. Sorry, you're extending at the hip. So you're getting pulled proximally, so up near the pelvis area, and distally down at the attachment onto the tibia. They're both getting pulled in either direction. So you're trying to slow down the knee and drive your leg down to the floor. So that's where your hamstring's really compromised. The other thing which is kind of interesting with the hamstring is that we have a long head of our bicep femoris and we have a short head. So there's effectively, like your biceps in your arm, there's a long head and a short head, right? So it's the same in your biceps femoris at the back of your leg. So we're talking about the hamstrings. The interesting thing with respect to injury and probably more so rehab with hammy injuries is that the long head and the short head are innervated by two different nerve branches. Innervation means it's the nerve supply. The long head is innervated by what's called the tibial portion of the sciatic nerve. Most people have heard of the sciatic nerve. Whereas the short head is innervated by the common peroneal branch. So you've got two power supplies to one muscle. So if you get any sort of desynchronized propagation of action potential, so if the stimulus to that muscle is compromised in any way, and there's lots of ways that it can be compromised because of injury or muscle activity, there's a lot of reasons why that can be compromised, then you get a desynchronized muscle contraction and increased propensity for injury. And that's really common with rehab. That's why a lot of people tear their hammies within the first 3 weeks of return to sport, because they have this desynchronized innervation to the muscle, and it's because of that dual innervation that is a big factor. The other thing, way back at the start of this, I was talking about myofibrils and fascicles. Fascicles, the short head of the short head of the bicep femoris has relatively longer fascicles than the long head. So fascicle length is a player in this as well. When you have different types of fascicle length, we have, again, potentially a predisposition for injury. The short head also has a smaller, what we call a physiological cross-sectional area. Physiological cross-sectional area, to break it down, refers to the number of little muscle fibres that are attached onto the tendon. So when they're on an angle, say at 45 degrees, you can pack many more fibres onto that tendon versus just if they square on, you won't get as many. So it's anatomical versus physiological cross-sectional area. Because it's got a smaller physiological cross-sectional area and longer fascicles, that's a more troublesome scenario from a loading perspective than if it's got larger physiological cross-sectional area and shorter fascicles. Which is fairly complicated, but there'll be people in the audience who know exactly what I'm talking about.
So from a him performance perspective in elite sport, are you guys looking at this when you're signing athletes?
Oh, not when you sign him.
No,
because you won't know that. I wouldn't have thought. It's a big player in So actually, I've got a PhD student who we might get him on here. He's a sports physiotherapist, and we might get him on here and talk about it. But we're looking at fascicle length and innervation characteristics in the bicep femoris. Most of the injuries, and there are people that want to debate this, but a large number of the injuries are in the proximal tendon of the long head of the bicep femoris. That's right up underneath your gluteal fold, under your butt. And that's where most people tear their hamstrings. To the haters out there, not every hamstring injury is there, but that's where a lot of them are, right? Oh man, I get a lot of people who just want to bring the heat. But let me tell you, that's where
it's a podcast. It's not about the heat.
I know, it's not a lecture, right? Although it sounds like that sometimes. But there's some stuff when it comes to risk. There's some work being done by a guy by Dave Opar. It was done quite a few years ago now. And again, recognising that research around alterable and unalterable risk factors. There's some things in life you can't do anything about that really increase your risk of hamstring injury. One is your age. And we know that, and it starts early, over 24 years of age, we see an increase in risk for every year of age of around about 1.3 to 1.8 times.
Is that right?
Yeah, it's pretty big, right? The biggest indicator of risk for injury is a previous injury. So if you've torn your hamstring, let's say you tear your hamstring in 2018, you've got 11 times likelihood of injuring it again next year.
Wow.
It's huge. And there's other issues around muscle fibre distribution. So whether or not people have a propensity for type 2, type 2X, type 2As, type 1s. There's a bit of ethnicity around that as well. With different. It's a bit of a unsubstantiated landscape research-wise. The other one, there are some things we can change, though, that are indicative. One is strength imbalances, and we know that quadricep hamstring strength ratios that are not particularly great, only sort of 0.5, 0.6, will see an increased risk. So the closer that strength profile between your quad and your hammy, the closer that is, the less risk. And we've been doing strength or force power profiling in athletes for decades. I listen to a lot of podcasts, a lot of people talking about it like it's new, but we use a thing called a reactive strength index, an RSI, and we can measure the ratio of your force capabilities and your power capabilities with things like jumping and so forth. So you can profile athletes, whether they're a force dominant or a power dominant athlete, and then you train them a different way. So your force dominant athlete they might be the person that are doing the heavy sled pushes.
Yep.
The power dominant athlete is the one that's got a lighter sled who's flying, doing high acceleration work. The other one's asymmetry. So it matters. If your left one is stuffed and your right one is good, that's a problem. That'll play havoc with your mechanics, your gait mechanics, your running mechanics. Yep. So it doesn't have to be great. I mean, even, again, the research tells us as little as 8% variation in strength characteristics between your left hamstring and your right hamstring leads to an increased risk. So, fairly subtle issues. Same with range of movement. If you've got one hamstring that's, you've got, like for example, with more prominent perhaps with risk for calf injuries, but we look at a thing called knee to wall or dorsiflexion range. So and that's where you bring your toes up towards your shin. So if you've got a remarkable variation between left and right, you've got a higher risk of injury. And that makes sense, right? If one's you can hardly move and the other's got lots of flexibility, then I think, like I said, way back in our very first podcast, nothing happens in isolation, right? There's a cause and effect. If you've got really poor range in your left ankle, then your knee's going to cop it. And your knee's not built to carry it, so then it goes to your hip. Then it ends up into your lower back, into your shoulder, and next thing you know, you get neck pain. So there's lots of things going on there, right? And that happens with post-surgical people when they've been in a boot for a long time. They lose range. Getting that range back is really important. So that increased risk of injury across the board. So there's my little rant. The other one, while we're talking about exercises and rants, is probably my other bugbear, which is bench press technique.
We need some music for your bugbears. Like they should just drop the music as it comes on.
Shouldn't it? It should just come in. So bench press. This is the other thing I see a lot in social media is different technique, and I'm not going to rave on about this one. But when it comes to bench press, I don't know how you bench press. How do you bench press?
Oh, not a hell of a lot, mate. I'm more functional training these days.
Oh, functional.
Yeah, I know you love that word, on my journey.
Yeah, functional training.
No, we don't line up much to bench press, to be honest.
My only bugbear with functional is people think just because you take a barbell out of it, it's functional. Swinging a kettlebell, well, hang on a minute. How many times a day you got to throw a rope on the floor?
Me personally.
Yeah. So you come to work and do rope slams? That's what I mean. Like, how functional is a rope slam? I'm not sure, right? That's my question. I don't know.
That's a good question.
Yeah. So how functional is that? How functional is slamming a medicine ball into the floor, really, versus some other exercise? I mean, does it help you get out of a chair?
True.
Any more than a squat? Oh, I'm just asking.
No, I think you're right.
Because I say, well, everyone says, well, it's functional this and it's functional that, and I'm like, tell me what's functional about, like a rope slam. I don't know what's functional about that. Someone maybe can tell me.
I normally think about people when I'm doing it.
So it
serves a different purpose.
Well, fair enough. I mean, if you work in a labour-intensive job and you're swinging on the end of a shovel or an axe all day, 100%.
Yeah.
That's what you want to do. But that's probably the last thing you want to do at the end of the day. Anyway, we're on a rant. I was going to talk about bench press because there's a couple of different types of bench we see. We see the strongman type bench press, which is the huge arch of the back. And I'm getting into some water here that people's ears prick because it's pretty contentious. Where people get their feet right up under their bum.
You're not a fan of that.
You're not?
I know you're not a fan.
No, I am if you're a powerlifter.
Oh, for powerlifting.
And this is what the whole crux of this talk is about. Yeah. Keep the main thing, right? If you want to get strong and it's all about load and angle and resistance arm, then that's how you bench, right? That's why powerlifters bench that way. But if you want to recruit pec major, then that's not how you bench, right? If you want to recruit pec major, and again, don't shoot me, shoot Brett Contreras, because Brett's the dude that's pumping this research out. He calls it a guillotine bench press, but it's a standard bench press with your feet on the floor, your bum on the bench, your back on the bench, your scapula on the bench, and you do your bench press, right? The traditional bench, what I would call a traditional bench press. And irrefutably, the EMG research that's been done tells us if you want to recruit pec major, if you want to recruit, let's keep it at pec major, you do guillotine bench press. You don't do the big arch of the back, powerlifter type bench press. That's a very different one. And again, from a loading perspective with muscle fibre type distribution, again, based on the research of the 70s, and I know that was a long time ago, but human evolution hasn't changed that much. Fibre types I'm talking about. Your pec major is about 60% fast twitch and about 40% slow.
Okay.
So there should be a tendency for heavier lifting in your bench, for your flat bench. Deltoid is probably your deltoid, so front of your shoulder, for those that aren't up with their anatomy. So for your shoulder press, your dumbbell raises and things like that, probably 55-60% slow twitch, maybe 40-45% fast twitch. So it's more of a volume-based training. You hit more volume for your delts. And for every muscle, we've got a fair idea. Biceps is about 50-50. You got to get heavy. If you're going to pick cherries, you're never going to get big, right? So you got to lift something heavy eventually with your biceps as well. Triceps is much more, believe it or not, fast twitch, about 70% fast twitch. So you got to get out of your comfort zone a little bit with triceps. Everything, erector spinae, so longissimus thoracis, iliocostalis, lumborum, spinale, thoracis, all of those are about 55% slow twitch. Things like, I don't know, everything. Everything has a muscle fibre type distribution. Your abs are about 45% slow, about 55% fast. So if you want to hit abs, it's not just don't do 1,000 sit-ups. You still got to put them under get some freight and get under a bar or do something. So, it's interesting in terms of, what we know about, fibre typing and exercise selection, which I've talked about, and also the prescription or the programming of the exercises around volume loads. So, like I said, if it's slow twitch, it's higher volume, it's 12, 15, 18, 20 reps.
Yep.
If it's fast twitch, it's maybe as low as 3 reps, 4 reps, 5 reps, 6 reps, up to 8 reps, something like that. And that's how you train it. So, there's the beauty of it is that you can mix it up quite nicely. And coming back to our conversation, then it's about, let's select the exercises. Let's put them in an order. And in terms of the order, there's been a lot of research done around well, what order should I do things in? Right? Should you come in and do your bicep curls and then do your pull downs? Well, it depends, right? And there is a technique called pre-exhaustion, which you would be familiar with, where, for example, I can't squat, right? I've had full shoulder reconstructions. I can't get a bar on my back, but I can do a safety bar squat and I can front squat. So I'll often pre-exhaust my quads by doing leg extensions, which is an isolation exercise. Yep. But for me, I can't squat 5 plates a side anymore because I can't hold on to it anymore. So, and it's pretty hard to front squat 5 plates a side.
Yeah, it would be.
Yeah, fairly intense.
Did you try?
I don't think I've ever tried that. No.
Okay.
So I do my leg extensions first, and it serves as a bit of a warm up. Blows out my quads, gets a heap of blood into my quads, and then I'll go and do my front squats or my safety squat or whatever it might be. So, but traditionally, and there's been a lot of research around this, you do, from a total workload perspective and from a recruitment perspective, the recommendations are our compound movements. So so your squats, your deadlifts, things like that, you do them first, early in the workout. 2 reasons. Well, you're neurally, from a neuro perspective, you are fresh, so there's no pre-exhaustion taking place. Yep. So from a neural perspective, the ability to recruit higher order motor units, and when I say higher order motor units, I mean your type 2 fibres, fast twitch. You want to get them going, and we've already said, depending on what you're trying to do, and depending on the muscle type, you need to. So it's a reasonable strategy, and to train those earlier. If you particularly want to really develop, if your biceps are really a weak point, then you want to train them early. Do them first if that's what your weak point is. So, there's lots of ways we can play around with it, and we'll do some other podcasts on some other topics. But in terms of how I do programming, we could probably talk about that. So we think about fibre type distribution. We think fundamentally around goal. Then we talk about, well, are there any limitations to what we can do in terms of exercises? Has the person had full shoulder recos? I've had 2 on each side, which makes it challenging. Or whatever else. You've had stuff happen, surgery, back and so forth. And then let's identify what the objective is, if it's hypertrophy, if it's strength. And then let's dial in the repetition range and the loading according to that. Put them in an order so that I'm going to get my best bang for my buck. I'm going to do my big stuff first. I'm going to deadlift early. I'm going to do my Romanians, things like that. Depends what I want to do. So you should ask. You want to be asking your trainer these questions. Well, not exactly those, but you want to be asking them. Okay, I want to develop my glutes. We've already said that the glutes are important for physique competition, particularly in females. I already said the hammies are the new glutes, so that presents some challenges because it is biarticular.
Sounds like a T-shirt.
What's that?
Hammies are the new glutes.
Hammies are the new glutes. Well, maybe. I think it is from a competitive perspective. So what are you going to do and how are you going to do it? So there's probably some exercises that are more specific.
That's actually a good question. How are you going to do it? What are your top 5 exercises for glute? Let's go. Number 1.
Oh, well, you've got a thrust, right? So I would do both the different types of thrust. So I would do the thrust from a bench. So
number 1.
Yep. You thrust from the floor.
Number 2.
That's probably 2. You've got actually an exercise that is pretty good. Well, your reverse hyper has to be in there. There's probably your 3rd. Glute bridges as opposed to your thrusts, a little bit of a variation on that. I think
number 4.
Yeah, probably 4. And then there's an exercise that I've never been a fan of, but the EMG data is supportive of it. I said Romanian deadlifts, not. Is you see people doing it on a cable pull through. I don't know if you've seen those. I don't really like them I like high box step ups.
Yep.
It's probably number 5 in terms of your go-tos for your glutes. You can rip into them quite nicely, and it doesn't mean you do every one of those every workout, right?
Yeah.
It means you mix it up. Anyone who's worked with me knows that I like reverse pyramids in terms of my loading. My philosophy is always heavy set, first set.
Yep.
So we come in, we do our warm up, and then if I'm trying to get strong, if you want to get strong, then I want to lift once I'm warm, and that might take 4 or 5 sets. I'm also an advocate of warming up with whatever it is I'm about to do. That means if I'm going to bench, I'm going to warm up on a bench. I'm not going to grab a 2 kilo dumbbell and do some silly little wave my arms in the air and convince myself I'm recruiting supraspinatus or infraspinatus. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about?
I've seen you in the gym, yeah.
Yeah. So warm-up specificity as much as exercise specificity, and then throw some freight on the bar and get underneath it. That's my philosophy. And then drop and you might do 8, whatever it is, 6 or 8. And then if you've done that properly, then you can drop the load a little bit by 5%, 10%, do your next set, and you'll get the same reps out. And then your next set will be a 5 or 10% drop on that. Do your next set. So you still meet your volume requirement, and you're meeting your intensity requirement. Other than ascending sets is where you do, you go the other way, and by the time you're on your 5th set, you've already done 4 sets and you're exhausted and you're trying to lift your heaviest weight. Yeah, it defeats the purpose, right?
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've done top 5 glute.
Yeah. Now we're doing top 5.
What's your top 5 hammy?
Top 5 hammy.
Yeah, mate.
Do you have a top 5 hammy?
Me personally?
Yeah.
No, mate. I'm asking you. You're the doctor.
No, that's okay. So hamstrings-wise, deadlift and deadlift variations. Traditional deadlift, Romanian deadlift, so 1 and 2, probably dead and Romanian. The other one would be a back extension. So you can work a bit more hamstring on your back extension type movements. It depends a lot on what you're trying to do, but there is nothing wrong with doing your traditional hamstring curl. For people who you're still going to recruit hamstring, right? So there's no reason why you can't do that. They're probably the main go-tos for your hammies.
I think that was only 4, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, you can throw in whatever you like. You can do a single leg sort of a single leg bridge. Yep. You'll get a fair bit of hamstring with that. Okay. So you know what a bridge is? Your foot-ups on the bench? Yeah, okay. So single leg bridges work pretty well. Bent knee bridges loaded with a band. Mix it up a little bit.
So the band's okay now?
No, I'm talking resistance band. Oh. I'm not talking the band that you put around your knees. I'm talking, the resistance bands that you wrap around the bar, not around your body. 2 different bands.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Right. I'm a big fan of the resistance band. I'm less of a fan of the other band.
Yes.
And people will want to shoot me. And hopefully people will still listen to this podcast after that because they're very popular.
Okay, if we're chucking some freebies in from a man who's done 14 years of study, we may as well throw quads in there as well for top quads.
5. Well, if you're going to train quads, you've got to squat, right? That's pretty much the story of life.
You said that before, yep.
So I would do your barbell squat. You can do your front squat.
2 squats, yep.
Yep. I actually advocate for athletic populations that they don't go very deep. They just they do their half squat. And even for some populations, they just do quarters. So if you're really explosive, so your NRL guys, they don't have to squat to the floor. Yep. There's no reason in the world. They're probably the main. There's only 3 for quads. Yeah.
5. We promised 5.
Oh, so they're probably your go-tos. You can still get an element of, although for guys I wouldn't get them to thrust just on principle, but you can get some of that with some of the movements there. Hip flexion type movements, anything like that will work pretty well for your quads. I like leg press, nothing wrong with that. Move around your feet. I like. It depends what equipment you've got available to you, but there are some really good squat machines. Mm-hmm. I like safety squats, with the safety bar. Front squats, I'm a big fan of front squats. Sumos.
I'm not.
Sumos. And then, single leg variations on that.
Okay.
Are a good option. Hack squats, although turn around the other way and do your hack squat in reverse would be my recommendation. They're probably your go-tos for that sort of thing, and get some volume in. So if you want to develop muscle mass, I think people dramatically undertrain. You've got to do, and people won't probably like this, but you've got to probably do 15, 16, 18 reps, 18 sets per exercise, per body part. Sorry, per body part, not per exercise. So that might be
18 by 5.
No, that's just 4 exercises with 4 sets. There's your 16 sets, right?
Exactly,
it's not that hard to do. And you can do that with drop sets and supersets and all that sort of stuff, compound stuff. There's a lot of, there's probably a podcast around terminology there with regard to giant sets and supersets and push-pull options. And
not a bad idea, actually.
Yeah, so there's a few things you can
So, mate, can we drop a little top 5 concept at the bottom of this podcast for people to have a look at?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think you just mix it up. A lot of girls, particularly, are hitting legs 4 times a week.
How many?
4.
4 times.
I know lots of girls competing in physique comps hitting their legs 4 times a week, minimum 3. I would just be saying to them, you've got to mix it up. So what I would do in that scenario, if I'm going to hit legs 3 times a week and I need to develop everything, then I would give a prioritisation to whatever part of, like, if you want to work on glute, quad, and hammy, and you're training legs 3 times a week, which is what a lot of people are doing. So for me, I would go Monday's a glute day, right? So I would lead off with my glute exercise. I probably do 2 really pretty, like your thrusts and those sort of movements early on. Get some load in there, and then it might be only a couple of exercises on quad and a couple of exercises on hammy. So you're not there all day, but you'd still satisfy your volume loading. So it might be the prioritization's on glutes. So let's get our 16 sets of glutes. Then let's do whatever it might only be 8 sets of quads or whatever it might be, and then it might only be 8 sets of hammies. Then you come in on if I do glutes on Monday, I would do quad on Wednesday, and then I would do it the other way around. First couple of exercises are going to be quads, followed up by hammy, followed up by glute. So whatever you do first is your prioritisation. Whatever you do last is going to be stuffed. And then on the Friday, it's hammy dominant day. So I come in, I'll hit my hammies early, do the hammies first, followed by glute, followed by quad. So everything has had an opportunity to be first, second, and third over your week. And then you pick your exercises, load up your volumes, and you're in good shape. And then if you're training the other days, you would do the rest of the, your chest and your delts and your arms and your back on the other days. So you might do I don't know, chest and arms on a Tuesday. You might do your back and something else on the Thursday, and Saturday might be your wrap-up day. You might do a full-body circuit. There's a heap of things you can do. But that's what I would do around prioritisation of muscle groups. Rather than come in and hit glutes first every day, then something else is going to lack. So whatever it's going to be, you might still say, well, I'm still training my quads every day, but I'm doing them last. You're not going to get the adaptation that you would get if you put them first. And you might mix that up a little bit where glutes are first on 2 of those days, depending on what you need. And that's how I would do it.
Nice.
Pretty simple.
Well, that's been a big podcast, mate. Thanks for that.
Easy.
Bodyscience.com.
Keep the main thing.
Exactly.
Hey?
bodyscience.com.au/podcast to grab those notes, download those top 5 tips, grab those research papers we mentioned on the way through. Enjoy.
Awesome. See ya.
This podcast was brought to you by one of our favourite products, Hydroxyburn Lean 5, available at ASN nationally, Sporties, DY Discount Vitamins, Fat Burners Only, Evelyn Faye and Rock Hard Supplements.